In this video, we will talk about computational models of reading. Computational models are a bit like theories. Our theories of word reading, either visual word recognition or word reading aloud, specify which factors affect these tasks and how they interact, aiming to help us understand how these cognitive processes take place. Computational models go a step further and actually implement the theories as computer programs. So you can then run the computer programs and see if the model can correctly predict which words, for example, will be recognized faster or slower, or whether the model will produce the same kind or the same proportion of errors as humans do when they try to read the same words. So computational models must be very explicit and very specific, otherwise they cannot be turned into computer programs. And they also necessarily are very detailed because in the end they have to work and produce an output. Computational models are extremely useful in our theoretical work because they help us understand the consequences of our assumptions, how they actually affect processing when they are implemented in conjunction with the other elements of a theory. There are several different theoretical approaches to word reading, as also they are in other fields, and computational models have been very important in helping us test our assumptions and compare the predictions of different theories by pitting the models against each other and finding out which ones produce results that are more like those seen in human behavior. A successful computational model is not one that always gets the answers correctly, but is one that makes the same kinds of errors in the same proportion as humans. The one that is affected by the same factors to the same extent when it is trying to carry out the same task, the one that it was made for. Or, more importantly, new tasks it wasn't made to address, but which may have come up after some testing. So they're very important tools for scientific verification of our theories. A computational model that does not produce the expected pattern of results indicates that our theory or our implementation is incomplete or incorrect and requires revision or further development. A computational model that does produce the expected pattern does not imply that our mind does the same task in the same way, but suggests that this is a plausible way to theoretically think about how it is done. One of the oldest models of visual word recognition is the interactive activation model. This was made in part to address the problem seen with the word superiority effect, which indicated that words could affect the recognition of the letters they were composed of, as if it were possible to recognize a whole word before its components were recognized. The approach taken by those researchers was to suppose that words and letters are simultaneously activated. So words and letters were like units. Here they're represented with these nodes, these elliptical shapes. Each one has a word. So words are entities within the model, which means that they are posited to be entities within the mind. And also letters are entities within the model. When we're looking at a written word, what we see are the features. So lines, horizontal lines, high up, vertical lines, diagonal short lines, and all the different visual features of letters. And our visual system recognizes these. By recognizing these, the letters that are consistent with the features you're looking at become activated. In a way, they wake up and they start shouting. And the more features feeding into the letter, so the more components of itself that a letter sees recognized, the more this letter becomes active and the louder it shouts. And when it shouts, it's calling the words that include it. So the letter A can activate the word able, which contains it, but inhibits the word trap. If you can see, this here is a little circle, whereas here it's a little arrow. The arrow means that the letter is activating the word. The circle means the letter is inhibiting the word. That's because letters are position specific, and these are here supposed to concern only the first letter of the word. So the letter A will only activate the word that contains it in its own position, in the first position. So a whole new set of feature detectors and letters must exist for every letter position that we can be looking at. Similarly, the letter T will activate the words that contain it in the first position, like trap and trip. Notice the arrows, and take and time, but will inhibit words that do not contain it in the first position. This expresses the idea that if you are seeing a letter T in the first position, you cannot be looking at the word able or the word cart or any other word that has another letter in the first position. And the more certain you are that the first letter is T, the more certain you can be that you aren't looking at able or cart, but you might be looking at trap, trip, take, or time. Obviously, this picture has only a very small subset of all the possible letters, features, and words. The other important property of this model is that letters inhibit one another in the same position. And that's for the same reason. If you are sure that you're looking at a T, then you can't be looking at an N. And you can't be looking at an A at the same position. So every letter inhibits every other letter in the same position. So basically, this means that the letter that receives the most supporting features, the letter that is most consistent with what you're looking at, will play it out with the other letters, and the one that has the most support will win, because that one will receive activation from features and will suppress the other letters, whereas letters with less support from features will not be sufficiently active to inhibit it back. So the right letter will win. But this happens at the same time as words are also activated and words also inhibit one another. Every word inhibits every other word. That's because if you're looking at the word take, you can't be looking at any of the other words at the same time. So words receive activation from the letters, from those letters that have been activated by the features, and words inhibit other words. And so the words played out, and the one that has the most support eventually wins. Now, where does word superiority come into effect? Words don't only inhibit each other. They can also activate the letters they contain. This was the crucial insight that allowed this model to account for the word superiority effect. So this means that the word trip will actually activate the letter T in the first position, as will the word take, as will the word time. Whereas the word able will instead activate the word A in the first position. So words are feeding back to the letters they contain. So this model can also account for the phenomenon where if one letter isn't very clearly perceived because it's ambiguous or because it's partially occluded, you can still recognize the words and you can still recognize the ambiguous letter thanks to the word. And that's why this model is called interactive activation, because letters and words interactively activate one another while simultaneously inhibiting everything that is incompatible. So this model works by being presented with a series of visual features for each letter position and letting the letters and words play out interactively until all the right letters and the one correct word eventually survive and remain the only active ones. The reason that the interactive activation model can account for the word superiority effect is that activation from other letters helps the word become activated and support the recognition of any letter that it contains. For example, if you have to recognize an isolated letter R without any word around it, then this letter will have to be recognized at this level based only on support from the corresponding visual features. So the features that you're looking at activate the letters that are compatible with them, inhibit the letters that aren't compatible with them, and so eventually the visual information for the letter R will suffice to activate the letter R unit up here and then be recognized. However, if you're looking at the word trip, which includes the letter R, the letter R in second position will still receive the same amount of visual information from the features for the second position. Remember, the second position is not shown in this simple diagram, but there are units for every feature in second letter position and for every letter in second position that aren't shown here. So the letter R will receive the usual visual input. In addition, the letter T in first position, right here, plus the letter I in third position, plus the letter P in fourth position, will be receiving their own visual input and will be becoming activated. And as those letters become activated, all four letters together activate the word trip. And the word trip activates all its own letters back down, including letter T in the first position, letter R in the second position, letter I in the third position, and letter P in the fourth position. So essentially what happens is that letter R now receives its usual visual information from below, plus information from the word that has been activated due to the information from the other three letters. So although nothing is yet completely recognized, the flow of activation that is caused by the additional visual information surrounding the letter R causes the letter R to become activated faster if it is seen in the context of a whole word than if it is seen all by itself. This was a very influential model, and in some ways it still survives inside other models. However, since that time, it has become obvious that there are more phenomena that need to be accounted for that this model could not address. In particular, a family of very interesting observations concerned patients who, after brain damage, had difficulty reading. It turned out that there were big differences in the kinds of words that some patients could read compared to other patients. Some patients were better at reading words that didn't exist, And some patients were better at reading words that were irregularly spelled, while they were not so good at reading new words they'd never seen before. So it looked like some patients could use their graphophonemic mappings very effectively. They could use phonological recoding, in other words, whereas other patients could use orthographic decoding, but not phonological recoding, at least not equally well. So this led to the idea that these two different kinds of decoding might depend on different mechanisms. And so the dual root model was born, and this is a drawing of the dual root cascaded model, which has survived to this day. The dual root cascaded model includes the interactive activation model as part. So the interactive activation model is here. This means that the dual root cascaded model assumes that individual words are stored as entities inside the model, that is, inside our minds. Indeed, they're right here. This is called the orthographic lexicon. And there are also the phonological word forms of the words stored as entities here. So this is the phonological lexicon. And in order to read the word aloud, what we have to do is by looking at print, by looking at a printed word, recognize the visual features, then identify the letters that are formed by these features, and simultaneously activate the words that are consistent with them. And then by direct links to the word's pronunciation, derive the corresponding phonological word forms, and then plan how to pronounce them as a series of phonemes and speak out the word aloud. The model has provision for an influence of meanings. However, this has not been implemented, although it is allowed for by theory. So semantic information may be stored here and is allowed to be activated by the recognized words, the recognized orthographic word forms, and is allowed to contribute to the activation of the pronunciation of the phonological word forms. The crucial addition of this model was the so-called indirect brute. The indirect brute assumes that there is a rule application mechanism here that maps individual graphemes to phonemes. So this doesn't work in the same way as this. This is a direct connection between orthographic and phonological word forms, but this is a rule application machine which works serially. Serially means that letters go in here one by one, and as soon as a grapheme is recognized, either a single letter or a letter combination, the corresponding phoneme is identified and sent out to be pronounced, and the next letter comes in, and the same happens again. So although letters are identified simultaneously, in parallel, they're not converted to phonemes simultaneously from this root. They are converted to phonemes simultaneously here if they are recognized as a known orthographic word form. Instead, letters go in here one by one, and so it takes much longer to work through them via this route than via this route. Both routes work simultaneously. But if you already know the word, and it's not too rare, so it can actually be activated in a reasonable amount of time based on the letter identification, what will end up happening most of the time is that the word will be identified, mapped, and pronounced before this is done converting, although it is converting. However, if you see a word that you don't recognize, you've never seen before, or you don't remember, then this will not produce anything, or may take very long to produce anything. But this just works letter by letter and will eventually produce something you can pronounce. So this is the indirect grapheme to phoneme route, and this is the direct word form route. And both of these are non-semantic. So this model has two roots that do not depend on meanings. Dependence on meanings would be a third root, but that's never been used because it's not implemented. One of the most important features of the dual root cascaded model is that it can very easily account for discrepancies in performance between pseudo words and irregular words. The distinction between regular and irregular words is very important in English because there are so many irregular words that aren't pronounced the way they're spelled. This means you cannot really predict how they're pronounced by looking at them and using the usual graphophonemic conversions. So this means that if you look at an irregular word like pint or have or yacht, then the application of grapheme to phoneme conversion rules will produce an incorrect result. So the only way to pronounce those words correctly, and many others in English, is to know the word and directly activate the correct pronunciation. So irregular words, which are so many in English, can only be read correctly via this route, which therefore must produce the appropriate response before this one is done converting. And this is how it's supposed to work in English. However, this route is useless when it encounters a new word, such as a pseudo word or just a word not seen before, because if it's not stored in here, then there will be no corresponding phonological word form to be activated. Therefore, it is only via this route that new words and unknown words can be read. This makes it very easy to account for the discrepancies seen in those patients with brain damage that had differential difficulty with these different kinds of stimuli. The distinction is much less important for languages whose orthographies are much more consistent, which in fact concerns most other alphabetic languages, including Norwegian. One important feature of this model that unfortunately some people tend to forget is that this was made to explain skilled reading by adult skilled readers, that is, and then to account for patterns of impairment after brain damage. So after the mental reading system had been damaged by a stroke or something like that. This was never meant to be a model of learning to read. And the serial application of rules from graphemes to phonemes was meant as a model of how skilled readers read pseudo words, not as a model of how beginner readers read words, because these two are very different things. A beginner reader goes through letters one by one in the beginning and then syllable by syllable, and indeed recodes serially. It is very doubtful that skilled readers actually recode serially, because we know now that word reading efficiency and pseudo word reading efficiency grow in parallel and seem to be influenced by the same kind of growth in reading skill, which is likely associated with familiarization and automatization of larger chunks. This model does not deal with syllables or any larger chunks that are less than whole words. However, this model is very easy to understand and embodies a very interesting distinction, the one between word knowledge and the one between graphophonemic mappings. This is a distinction we've drawn in this course as well. However, this model claims that these two mappings are done in completely different ways. This is done by serial rule application, whereas this is done by interactive parallel activation. And this is much more than we have said when we were discussing the two ways of phonological mediation earlier in this course. So this is a more specific model that makes more specific predictions. This model has been applied to children's reading development with some success. Unfortunately, it has also produced the prediction that there are different kinds of reading problems, in the sense that some children should be expected to have this part malfunctioning, and other children might be expected to have this part. So if there are two parts, they can be expected to be differentially efficient. And this led to the prediction that there can be different types of dyslexia, as there are different qualitative patterns of performance seen in patients after a stroke. But children with reading problems aren't patients with strokes and do not exhibit these patterns in the same way. And in fact, it has been very difficult to discern the predicted subtypes. Another kind of model that you will see in the literature very much is the so-called triangle model. The triangle model is unfortunately much more difficult to understand, not intuitive at all. It posits that there are three domains of processing: orthography, phonology, and semantics, and that these are connected through intermediate layers such that they can activate each other. All of them can activate each other. What makes this difficult to understand is that the processing units here, these little circles, the processing nodes, aren't words. In fact, individual words are not represented anywhere locally in this model. You cannot find any individual word in here. Words are represented as distributed patterns of activation. What does this mean? It means that you have to look at how much all of these nodes are activated, and the whole pattern taken together may correspond to a specific word. And the same here. The whole pattern may correspond to a phonological form of a word, and here an entire pattern will correspond to a set of semantic features that have to do with the meaning of one word. So the idea that word forms and word meanings are not concrete entities in the mind, but rather distributed patterns of activation over some sets of units, although it is mathematically and computationally not very difficult to conceive of and implement, is in fact very unintuitive and very difficult to think about in concrete terms. So this model specifically assumes that individual words aren't entities, but they're patterns of activation. In this model, reading amounts to going from an orthographic representation triggered by incoming letter information through an intermediate layer to a phonological representation, which can then be pronounced. And this model allows for the possibility that the orthographic representation, based on the recognized letters, can also activate semantic information, which can contribute to the activation of the appropriate phonological form, which can be pronounced. In a similar fashion, accessing the meaning of a word that you're looking at involves a direct activation from orthographic to semantic information, as well as a simultaneous indirect activation through the phonological form. In a model like this, all the units in all of these layers operate in parallel, simultaneously, activating, connecting up to others, and activating or inhibiting them. So there are positive connections that activate one another, and there are negative connections that by which a unit can inhibit another unit. And so this kind of network starts off with an orthographic pattern of activation here based on incoming letters and reach a state of equilibrium in which a corresponding phonological form and meaning have been activated. So this is a very different way to conceptualize how words are recognized. And very importantly, there is no difference in how one goes about reading known words or unknown words. The only difference is that if it's a known word, it has a meaning so that semantics can help. But if it's an unknown word, it has no meaning. So this is not going to be activated and will not contribute. So in a sense, this is also a dual root type of model. But the dual root, the second root, is actually semantic mediation. This model incorporates many very attractive ideas, and crucially, it incorporates learning. In fact, it's not possible to create this model by hard coding information. It is not possible to compute the word properties and the connections between units. The only way to make the model such as this work is by training it with a very large number of words. And usually people only use the orthography and phonology, although some crucial studies have also tried to implement semantics in a very limited way. So theorists working with these kinds of models present pairs of word forms, orthographic and phonological word forms to the model, and allow the model to fine-tune its own connections to be able to reproduce these activations. So this is called training. And this is very unlike how a child learns to read. So this is a problem for this kind of model. Although the model learns how to perform these mappings by the training process involves many millions of repetitions, including many repetitions of each individual word in pair with its pronunciation, which is a very unrealistic way to model how children learn to read. However, this model does not include any rules. So any learning that is achieved here is purely statistical. It's based on the repetition and common patterns. And when the patterns are uncommon, so irregular words, then it is based on learning that specific patterns of activation must be connected to other kinds of patterns in contrast to the statistics. And to this effect, it is very useful when semantics is implemented because semantics can help resolve ambiguities, and very importantly, semantics can contribute to the correct decoding of irregular words. So this kind of model makes the important prediction that it is the balance between the direct and the semantically mediated root that dictates how regular and irregular words will be recognized. These models have their own sets of problems in addition to the implausibility of the training process, and they're being very difficult to understand, that they also do not scale very well. It's hard to make them very large with realistic sets of words, and they also tend to produce some mistakes which are not made by humans. So when this model does not read a word accurately, the inaccurate reading does not look very human always. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. However, these kinds of models have been very influential in helping us understand some of the statistical principles that seem to guide learning to read words that are also observed with children learning to read. It has also been very successful in accounting for the patterns seen in the performance of patients after brain damage, which is what this model, as well as the previous model, were initially made to account for. In recent years, researchers have been trying to adjudicate between these two models, not only by running behavioral experiments, but also by brain scanning. So some studies try to identify areas in the brain that might correspond to the functional elements of the models by testing predictions derived from the models. For example, how words of different lengths or of different frequencies might affect the processing. And then mapping the effects seen in brain imaging to the functional elements that are posited by each model. Some researchers have claimed success in mapping brain areas to functional elements of these models, but this work is currently ongoing. The important thing to remember is that computational models of word reading are very influential and very important because they force us to be very detailed and concrete in our theories, and they're very explicit in the implementation so that they produce actual outcomes that cannot be disputed. And so by comparing the predictions of theories to the outcomes of the models and the behavioral results obtained in human experiments, either with adults or with children, we can gradually increase our understanding of how the mind manages to read words.